Hello, everyone, and welcome to this training session on the uses of groups in Qualtrax. My name is Josh Walthall. I'm a product consultant here at Qualtrax, and I will be your presenter for this session. Joining us as well, we also have Jacqueline Norcus from the customer support team. Jacqueline will be the moderator for this session, so any questions that you have during this session, please place them into the attendee hub, and Jacqueline will be answering them there. We'll also be saving some questions for the end. I'm setting aside about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'll answer those questions directly then. All right, so in this training session, what you're going to learn is, first off, what groups are in Qualtrax, also the core attributes of those groups, the ways you can use groups in Qualtrax, and also I'm going to tell you about some ways to think about groups that you may find useful to get the most out of them. Now, before we actually dig into the content, I want to kind of set a baseline here. So what I'm going to do is show you an example user. And the main example user that I'm going to use during this training is Dr. No. So in keeping with the theme of our conference, I've created a user in our site called Dr. No. And that's the lens through which you're going to be viewing a lot of the changes and settings and different things that I'm going to configure using groups. But I'll also show you some other example users as well as we go through this to illustrate how groups work. So to start out, I want you to see what Dr. No's current view of Qualtrax is. So I'm going to bring up his login. So this is Dr. No. He's logged into Qualtrax right now, and you can see in his inbox there are no items assigned to him. Also, on the main navigation menu on the left, you may notice that there is no personnel option. Dr. No does not have access to that. There is no administration option either. Also, if we click on documents, you can see that Dr. No currently only has access to the external facing documents. And if I click on workflows, you can see that he only has access to launch the sandwich creation workflow, which sounds very important, but this is the only one he can launch. So Dr. No is a new user that's been added into the system. He has not yet been added to any groups and doesn't have any of those settings configured for him. So this is what he sees. So I just wanted to use that as kind of a foundation to establish here. And then as we go through this training, you'll see how this changes for this user based on our usage of groups. So let's start with the basics. What are groups? So groups are just sets of users that are utilized throughout the system. That's the simplest explanation of them. Groups are just ways to group your users in different ways. And so you can then configure settings for those groups of users. Now, there are some core attributes of groups that it's important to know because they go into how these operate. The first one is that groups contain members, right? So you have a group, it contains members. That's kind of essential to it. Without any members in a group, it wouldn't do anything. Also, it's important to know that the settings for a group apply to all the members of that group. This is something that's really important to understand. Anything that you configure for a given group will be passed along to all the members of that group. Also, the groups in your system are created by your admins. So any of the groups that you see in there, your administrators have created. Now, there is one group that is an exception to this, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But other than that, for the most part, they are created by your admins. And then lastly, a core component of groups is that they can be created, enabled, disabled, and removed. So you have full control over them. You can do any of these as needed. So I'm going to demonstrate these core components of groups first so that you understand how to create and modify your groups. And then from there, we'll build on the ways you use your groups in the system. So I'm going to bring up my own login to Qualtrax here. I've got administrative privileges, so I get to see and do more than Dr. No does. So your groups are created and modified from the groups administration page. And you reach that page by clicking on administration and selecting groups. Now, you only have this option if you have the groups administration permission. That's what allows you to access this. On this page, you can see that it shows on the left here all the different groups in our system. So first, I want to show you how to create a group and add members to it. So we'll just start with that, that basic point here. So I'm going to click on Create. That brings up the group creation window. And I'm going to click in this field for name, and we just need to name our group. So let's say that we want to create a group for our henchmen, right? So I'm going to type in the name henchman. You can see that under this, I've got a lot of different permissions that I can select. There's checkboxes on the right, and I can select any of those. But for this group, I'm not going to give henchmen any permissions. I don't want them to have permissions. We'll talk about permissions more here in just a moment, but I just want to create a basic group without any permissions. So I'm going to do that, click Save. And then now if I scroll down, you can see that the henchman group shows up in the system. Now you may notice that the icon for it, the folder icon for this group, is grayed out. And that's because this group is not yet enabled. Once a group is enabled, you can then use it in the system. And in order to enable a group, it first has to have at least one member. So the first thing I want to do is to add a member to this group. To do that, you just right-click on the group, go to Add, Remove, and select Members. It'll show you all the different users in the system. I'm going to select Dario to check the box next to his name and click Save. And then now if I go down to the henchman group and expand it, you can see that Dario is a member of that group. However, the henchman folder is still grayed out because the group is not yet enabled. So once the group has at least one member, you can enable it by right-clicking on it and selecting Enable. And now that folder icon is solid, this group is enabled. You can think of the Enable option as basically the on switch for this group. When you enable a group, it can now be used. And it's now going to confer the settings for that group to the members of the group. And disable is the off switch, basically. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, something else that is important to know as well is that users can be members of multiple groups. Okay, so just because I added Dario to the henchman group doesn't mean that I'm restricted from adding him to any other group. And in fact, a lot of times your users will be members of multiple groups. Additionally, the members of groups are most commonly going to be users, like in this case, we added Dario. But groups can also be members of other groups. So for example, if I scroll down to the Spectre group that I've created and click the plus sign next to it to expand, we can see that the villains group and the villains leadership group are both members of this group. And they are members of the group in the same way that users are. So settings will cascade down to them and the members of those groups in turn. So if I expand villains, you can see within there is a mad scientist group, and I can expand that and see a user within that group as well. All right, so let's say that we wanted to add the henchman group to this group, to the Spectre group. Well, to do so, you just right-click on the group you want to add them to, go to Add, Remove, and click on Members, the same way that you would add in users. Now, again, it shows me all the users in the system, but if you see there's a view drop down here at the top, if you hover over that, the first option is Users View, which is what we're seeing right now, but you can also select Groups View. And this will show you all the groups in the system, and you can select any number of them to make them members of the group. In fact, if I scroll down, you can see that the villains and villains leadership group are already checked. They are members of this group currently. So I'm going to check the box next to henchman to select that group, click on Save. And then now when I go back to Spectre and expand that group, you can see that henchman is a member of that group. If I expand that, you can see Dario is a member of henchman. So this is the way in which you can nest groups within other groups. Now, I touched on this just a moment ago, but what applies to groups applies to every member of that group. Okay, this is very important to keep in mind. So any settings that are applied to group will apply down to every member. And because of that, I always say that settings, cascade down to all members of a group, even groups that are members of a group. So the settings for Spectre cascade down to villains, those cascade down to mad scientists, and those cascade down to the users in that group or the members of that group. So they would have the settings and permissions and all the things we configure for all of those groups because they are members of each of them. Now I talked as well about how groups are created by your admins. So all the groups that we see here have been created by administrators for our system, but there is one group that is an exception to this, and that is the all users group. If I click the plus sign next to that to expand it, you can see that this group contains all of the users in our system. And it actually doesn't contain any groups. So this is a unique group in that the system will automatically manage the members of this group. The all users group will always contain all of your enabled users. So as soon as a user is created and they are enabled, they're added to this group. As soon as you disable a user, they are automatically removed from this group. So this is set up because it's a convenient way to configure settings that apply to all users. You may have certain items that you need to assign to everyone that uses your Qualtrax server, regardless of what team they're on or what role they're in. You can do that using the all users group, and you know that those items are going to be sent to or assigned to everyone in your system. All right, so I showed you how to create groups, how to add members to groups. I talked about groups being members of groups. We also talked about enabling groups, right? So in addition to that, I had mentioned that groups can be disabled and they can also be removed. So let's go back to that henchman group. Let's say that I wanted to disable this group. To do so, you just right click on it and select disable. And when I do that, you can see that the folder icon for it has grayed out again. But Dario is still a member of this group, right? So what's happened here is the group is disabled, which means that it's essentially turned off. So this group isn't going to do anything while it's disabled. It's not going to confer permissions from the group. It's not going to assign items, that we assign to that group. It's just not going to do anything. Disabling a group is useful if you know that you need to take it offline for a certain period, but you want to save it in there in case you need to use it later. Maybe there are modifications that you want to make, and then once you're done with that, you'll enable it again. Being able to disable a group is useful for that. Now, you can also remove a group. Let's say that we didn't need this group in the system anymore at all. You can right-click on the group and select remove. Now, when you do this, you will get a secondary prompt. This is the case with a lot of things in Qualtrax. When you go to remove something, you get a confirmation message just making sure that you want to do this. So I am sure I want to delete the henchman group, so I'm going to click OK. And then now that group is gone from the system. Also, if I scroll down and expand the Spectre group, you can see it's not a member of Spectre either because it is completely gone from the system. So those are the basics of how you create groups, how you add members to groups, enabling, disabling, and removing, and also adding groups as members of other groups. So now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and add our Dr. No user to the group that he's going to be in, which is Mad Scientist. All right, so he's coming onto the Spectre organization in the role of Mad Scientist, so I want to add him to this group. To do so, I'm just going to right-click on Mad Scientist, go to Add Remove, select Members, and then I'll check the box next to Dr. No's name and click Save. Now, when I scroll down and expand Mad Scientist, you can see that Dr. No is a member of that group. Additionally, if I scroll down to Spectre, we can expand Villains. There's Mad Scientist, we can expand that, and there's Dr. No. So he's in the Mad Scientist group, and he's also nested within these other groups as well. And we'll get to see some of the effects of this here in a few moments. So now that we've talked through the basics of what groups are, what their core components are, and how to create them and modify them, let's talk about how you actually use groups in the system. So there are four main categories of uses of groups in Qualtrax. The first one is permissions. I showed you when you create a group, you have a list of permissions there. You can also see that if you edit the properties of a group. So that is one use of permissions or of groups, is that you can apply permissions to a group and those permissions are conferred to everyone in that group. The next category of item that you can use groups for is security and access. So with this, I'm talking about document, view, and edit security, access to workflow instances, things like that. The next category is tasks and responsibilities. This one is a fairly broad category, and it can include things like workflow steps that someone is responsible for, tests that they need to take, or even document review, for example. And then the last category of uses of groups in Qualtrax is notifications. So, notifications that get sent out to your users, you can have them be sent to groups if you need to, which we do recommend doing. So understanding each of these uses is foundational to fully utilizing your groups in Qualtrax. And as we go through this, I hope to highlight that, thoughtful configuration and application of groups makes administrating Qualtrax faster and easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these different categories and show you where all of these are configured in the system and talk a little bit about those. So we'll start with the first one, which is permissions. So I'm going to bring up my admin account here again in Qualtrax. And I showed you that when you create a group, you've got permissions down here, and you can hover over any of these and you'll see a blue question mark. If you click on that, it will show you a description of what this permission is and how it operates in the system. This is also the same thing you'll see if you right click on a group and select edit properties. It'll show you the permissions there as well. So that little blue question mark that shows you the description of the permission is really just a convenience thing. It's there for a quick reference for kind of, one-off needs to like reference that. But there is another way to access the full list of permissions in the system, and that is through your help guide. So on the bottom left of your screen, wherever you are in Qualtrax, you'll see this help guide link. If you click on that, it'll open up the Qualtrax help guide. And this is basically an instruction manual for everything in Qualtrax. It's a very valuable resource. I definitely recommend using this and referring to it whenever you want to know specifics about how things operate in Qualtrax or where they are. I refer to this on a regular basis. So very, very useful. If we go to our help guide and expand administration, user management, and select permissions, or you can click on search and just type in permissions, this will show you the full list of permissions in the system. Now, there are a lot of them, and we do recommend reading through this and familiarizing yourself with them. I will say initially that permissions are mostly going to be admin functions and other high-level abilities. In fact, if you look at the top of the page here, it starts out by saying that Qualtrax permissions grant administrative control, as well as some other things as well. So most of these are going to be things that you can think of as like powers in your system. And because of that, permissions aren't needed to perform the core functions in Qualtrax. So depending upon how you configure the other settings in your system, a user with no permissions can still view and edit documents, review and approve documents, complete tests and trainings, launch workflows, complete workflow steps that are assigned to them, and even run reports. Now, all of those things that I just mentioned are configured elsewhere in the system, not using permissions. In other words, I'm not saying that someone with no permissions will automatically be able to do all of those things. Instead, I'm just saying that those things are not managed through permissions. They're managed through other settings in the system. Another thing to keep in mind too is that although permissions can be granted directly to individual users, and in fact, a lot of the things that I'm going to show you in today's session, you can configure using individual users. Controlling these things through groups is faster, more efficient, and much easier to manage over the long term. And permissions are no different. It's much easier to manage them with groups. Now, we've got a lot of permissions here, a lot of possible permissions. Let's say that I want to see what permissions a given user has. Maybe I want to see what permissions Dr. No has. Now, I could go through the groups list here and try and find every group that Dr. No is a member of and see what permissions they have and everything like that. But that takes a lot of time. There's a much faster, easier way to access this, and that's by clicking on Administration and going to Personnel. From this screen, you can see all the users in the system. There's Dr. No. If I move over to the right, there's a link for View Permissions. And if you click on that, it's going to show you all the permissions that this user has. And on the right, it shows you where they're receiving those permissions from. So we can see there are 2 permissions here from the Mad Scientist group. But Dr. No is also receiving permissions from the Villains group and from the Spectre group, because Mad Scientist is a member of Villains and Villains is a member of Spectre. So because of that, Dr. No has all of those permissions. So this is a really quick way to pull this information up. And this can be extremely useful if you have someone that maybe says, hey, for my job role, I'm supposed to be able to do X, Y, and Z, but like I can't access it in the system. You can come here and check and see, do they have the permissions that they need? If not, okay, you can configure your groups differently. You could create a new group and assign those permissions as needed. Alternately, if a user has access that they should not have, they're able to do things that they shouldn't be able to do, this is a good place to come and see, okay, what permissions do they have? Where are they receiving them from? Maybe they are in the wrong group. So definitely use that whenever you need to see that information. All right, so that is permissions. Again, read through that list of permissions in the help guide. Those are some pretty powerful things. They give people the ability to do some fairly consequential things. The one I always like to highlight is the permission for data retention. If we go to the help guide here and go to administration user management permissions, data retention is the permission that gives people the ability to delete things from the system, delete documents, workflow instances, test instances, and training instances. And once something is deleted, it's gone. You can't get it back, right? So obviously this is a very consequential permission to have. I like to highlight that one because it does kind of make people perk up because, when it comes to compliance, you don't often want to delete things. So definitely read through this, familiarize yourself with it. The next category of things that you can configure using groups is security and access. And with this, I'm talking about the ability to view or edit documents, workflow instances and definitions, and reports. So let's start with documents. I'm going to click on documents here to access our document tree. And so when I'm talking about, security for documents, I'm talking about who can view and edit them. And this can be configured at the folder level or at the document level. So let's start with the folder. I'm going to click on the secret layer locations folder and then folder properties. On the properties for this folder, there is a security tab. And on here, you can see that I've already configured some settings for groups. So the Spectre group has view security to this folder and its contents. And the template manager group has view and edit security to it. So this is where we're controlling who can see these things and who can edit them. You can see as well below this is a list of the groups in our system. And we can select any of these to add them. So for example, if I wanted to make it so that the Mad Scientist group could be editors or could edit this folder and its properties, I can just check Mad Scientist, click Add Groups, and then grant them view and edit security to it. View and edit security are integral to document control. So you'll definitely want to think about how you want to configure this for your different folders and documents based on the needs for your organization. Now, I told you that you can also configure this at the document level as well. So if I click on Documents and go to the Secret Layer Locations folder and click on Locations of Secret Layers and click on Properties, there is a security tab here as well. And here are the security settings for this document. Now, they're the same as at the folder level. And in fact, I can look at these settings right now, but I can't change them. And that's because this checkbox here, Inherit Settings from Parent. So by default, the document will inherit its security settings from the folder that it is within. But if you needed to make it so that the document has different security settings than the folder, you could just uncheck this box, and then now you can modify this. We could add in groups, we could set their view and edit security as needed. Generally speaking, you'll want to manage it from the folder level when you can, because it does just make it easier, but just know that you have the option to manage it at the document level. So you use groups to manage the security for your folders and documents. This is actually one of the places in the system that you can only use groups. I talked about a moment ago that many of the things I'm going to show you, you can configure individually, but we recommend using groups. Security is only managed through groups. So keep that in mind. So to help demonstrate this, I'm going to bring Dr. No's Qualtrax instance back up here. So again, here's the login for Dr. No. I've made some changes since I brought this up last. So I'm going to click Inbox again to refresh. And you'll see that we get some additional options. I now have an administration option. But what I want to highlight here is if I click on Documents, now Dr. No can see the Spectre folder, and he can see the subfolders within it and the documents within those. So again, I added him to the Mad Scientist group. Now he can see the Spectre folder because I've already configured these folders to have the security that I want for the Mad Scientist group. The next area in the system that you can configure security and access using groups is workflow definitions and workflow instances. So with this, I'm talking about who can view workflow instances, who can edit completed workflow instances, who can view workflow definitions, and who can edit workflow definitions. So I'm going to minimize Dr. No for right now. And we can see I'm back on my admin account here. If I click on administration and select workflows, that will take me to the workflow administration page. Now, you will have to have the workflow administration permission to access this page. Once you do, this will show you any of the definitions to which you have access. So let's go to this giant space laser workflow. This is a process for building and deploying a gigantic laser in space, which is very important to mad scientists. I'm going to click on the title for that to access the settings. And you can see that under workflow definition settings, we've got instance access and definition access. And so this is where we can control this access for our workflow. So first off, there's instance access. And you can see that villains, leadership, and mad scientists all have view access to this workflow's instances. So an instance of a workflow is just an individual workflow. Let's say you have a corrective action workflow in the system, someone launches it, they input a specific corrective action. That is an instance of that workflow. So you'll want to grant view security to any of your users that need to be able to search for and pull reporting data on workflow instances. They'll need view security to them because otherwise they won't be able to see those instances. So view security lets you see all instances of a workflow. If someone does not have view security to a workflow instance, then they will only be able to see the instances of that workflow that they themselves have launched or have been involved in. You've also got the edit completed workflows access. You may not use this very often, but there could be certain situations or certain workflows where you need this. Anyone who has the edit completed workflows access will be able to go into workflows that are complete and edit the data in them. So just know you have that option as well. Now we can see that there are some groups here. So how do I actually add groups? To do so, you just click on Open Options next to Instance Access, and it'll show you a list of the groups in the system. And you could come in here and select any number of these and click Add Personnel, and then configure the settings for them. You also have a remove link if you need to remove any of them from having this access. You also have definition access. So I told you about workflow instances. The workflow definition is basically all of the settings we're looking at here. The definition is what steps are in a workflow, what fields, who are the responsible parties, all the configuration for how a workflow works. So you can control who has access to the definition as well. And we can see here that villains, leadership, and mad scientist all have view security to this definition. So if a user does not have view security to a definition, then they won't be able to see that definition. If they have view security to it, they can see the definition and they can see all of the settings for it, but they can't make any changes to it. If they have view and edit security, then they can see the definition, all the settings, and they can change them. I have view and edit security to this, so I can modify any of these changes. Now to help illustrate this, let's go back to Dr. No's account here. So Dr. No now has an administration option with workflows. So since he was added to Mad Scientist, he now has the workflow administration permission. So if I click on workflows under administration, I see this message. Now this is important to know. If you make changes to some of these admin functions or other things, your user may need to log out and log back in order to see those changes in effect. So we're going to log out of Dr. No really quick, and then we're going to log back in. So now if I go to administration workflows, we can see the workflow administration page, and I can go to this giant space laser workflow. If I click on that, Dr. No can see the settings, but can't change any of them because he only has view security. So this is what it'll look like for those users. They can click on different steps. They can see all the settings for the workflow. They just can't make any changes to them. All right, so another place that you can use groups in the system to configure security and access are reports. If you click on reports, you can see all the different reports in your system. You've got the system tab here. Those are the ones that are loaded in here by default. And then you also have the document, workflow, test, and training tabs, which will house the custom reports that you create for those categories. Now you'll notice for each of these tabs, there's an edit column for these reports. We can click on the edit link for a report. Let's go to the workflow giant space laser progress update report. I'm going to click edit on that. Now, since this is a custom report, there are a lot of settings we can configure, but there's also the security tab. And this is where you configure who can see this report, who can access it, and who can edit it. So right now, Villains Leadership and Mad Scientist both have view security to this report, which means they can run the report. but only Villain's leadership has edit security, which means they can change the settings. I am a member of Villain's leadership, so that's why I'm able to come in here and change these settings. Now, it's also important to know here that if you give someone view security to a report, that doesn't override their view security or access on the items that may show up on that report. So let's say that someone has the ability to run a document report, and you've got documents in the system that they don't have view security to. Well, they can't circumvent that by running the document report. It's not going to show them documents they shouldn't see. It's only going to show them the ones they should see. Same goes for workflow instances. Someone does not have workflow instance access and they run a workflow report, they'll only see the instances that they themselves have launched or have been involved in. So think about the conjunction, the interaction between things like the security setting and things like access, the instance access, the access to the report, that kind of thing. Now, on this report, like I said, the mad scientist can view this, but they can't edit it. All right, so let's take a look at Dr. No's view again. So if we go back to Dr. No and click on reports, on the workflow tab, he can access this giant space laser progress update report. But you'll see that he only has the run link. He doesn't have edit and he doesn't have remove because those are only granted for people that have edit security to that report. All right, so that's all the places in the system you can configure security and access using groups. The next category that I want to tell you about are tasks and responsibilities. Now, there are a lot of different tasks and responsibilities that you will need to assign to your users, and using groups to do this makes the process much faster and easier. So let's minimize Dr. No. I'm going to go back to my admin account here, and let's talk about the different types of tasks and responsibilities. The first one I'll highlight is tests. So if I click on administration and go to testing, let's take a look at this deadly lasers test. This is probably really important for mad scientists as well. On here, we've got a test takers tab. And you can see on this tab, it shows me a list of all the groups in the system. And this is where I would come in and choose who are the groups that are going to be assigned this test. Currently, I already have the mad scientist group configured down here as a test taker. So when this test is sent out, it will be sent to that group. You'll see there is a send test now column as well. You could check that box and click send test now if you needed to manually send out the test at that time. But most of the time, people will use the settings on the general tab to set up a schedule for these tests. Now, this training doesn't cover, this in-depth information about tests. Most important thing to know here is just that on the test takers tab, you can choose groups to assign that test out to those groups and to the members of those groups. The next type of task and responsibility that I want to talk about is trainings. So if I go to administration and click on training, it'll show me the list of all the trainings in the system. And here's this World Domination 101. This is something that all villains have to take. So I'm going to click on that link for World Domination 101. And on here, we have a training attendees tab. Again, we see all of the groups in the system. We can select any number of those and click add. And right now it's configured so that all villains need to take the World Domination 101 training. Let's take a look at Dr. No's inbox again. I'm going to bring this back up. So this is Dr. No's account. I'm going to go to his inbox. Now, I highlighted before at the beginning of the session that he had no tasks assigned to him. Now in his inbox, he has a category for trainings to complete. And if I expand that, I can see a link to the World Domination 101 training. So this is another really convenient feature of Qualtrax. If you have a training set up that's assigned to a group, when you add a user to that group, the training is automatically sent to their inbox. So this is a really good thing to configure for certain types of trainings that all of your new hires or all of your employees need to take, or everyone on a certain team or in a certain role. If you assign that training to that group, someone is added to that group, the training gets sent to them automatically. Okay. The next type of task and responsibility that I want to highlight is workflows. So you can use groups to control who is responsible for different parts of your workflow. I'm going to click on administration and go to workflows. And we'll pull up this giant space laser workflow again as an example. And I'm going to click on the first step of this workflow. And you can see it shows some responsible parties here. We've got villains, leadership, and mad scientist. So whoever the responsible parties are for a workflow is who is responsible for completing that workflow step. For most of the steps of the workflow, what that means is when it gets to that step, it's assigned to those responsible parties. They get it in their inbox. They'll often get an email message. But the first step of a workflow is a little bit different. The responsible parties for the first step of a workflow is who can launch that workflow. And so that's what we're looking at here. We can see that villains, leadership, and mad scientist can both launch this workflow. And if we wanted to add or modify the responsible parties, you can just click on open options next to that. And again, it shows the groups in the system. And you could select any number of these and click add responsible parties. You can also click the remove link to remove any of them as responsible parties if you need to. And so we can see for the second step of this workflow, source space laser parts, the villains are responsible for that step, whereas the third step, construct space laser, falls to the mad scientist group. So using groups as responsible parties is extremely useful because, again, it makes it much more convenient. I know that it's going to go to everyone in that group, and I don't have to set it up using individuals, which takes more time. Let's go back to Dr. No's account really quick. I'll show you the effect of this. So this is Dr. No's account. If I click on workflows, we have sandwich creation. Now, I don't see the giant space laser one, and that is because I forgot to put it back online. So I'm going to click put online as the admin. There we go. Now it's online. If I go back to Dr. No's account and click on workflows again to refresh it, there is giant space laser. So he didn't have access to launch this before, but now that he's a member of Mad Scientist and Mad Scientist is a responsible party for the first step of the workflow, Dr. No can now launch this workflow. All right. The next category of tasks and responsibilities is document review and document approval. So I'm going to click on documents here, and let's go to the Dastardly Plans folder. I'll select that and click on folder properties. And on folder properties, I have a document list tab. This tab is where you're going to configure the approval, review, and notify lists. Approval and review are integral to document control. This is how you define who are the approvers for documents and who are the reviewers for documents. We can see here that the villains are set up as reviewers and the villains leadership are set up as approvers. And below this, you can also see, again, a list of all the groups in the system. I could select any number of these and click add users groups and then change these different settings under approvers, reviewers, and notify to configure those as needed for that group. So let's take a look at the document level as well, because this is something that's important to know too. You can configure this at the folder level or at the document level. So if I go to documents and we select that plan for world domination and click properties, you can see that there is also a document list tab there as well. And so you can configure this setting at the document level if you need to. All right. So those are all of the different tasks and responsibilities that you can assign using groups. The last category of things I want to tell you about are notifications. So actually, let's go back to this same page because on document lists is where I want to show you the first notification. So your Qualtrax server sends out emails to your users for various items that they need to be aware of, and you can configure these things. So you can use groups to help manage those notifications and ensure that they're sent to the appropriate people. The notify list is one type of notification. So what we're looking at here are the properties for the document plan for world domination. And the villains group is set up as notify yes. So whenever a new revision of this document is published, everyone in the villains group will be notified about that. This is one of the types of notifications you control using those groups. Another type of notification that you can control are email actions. If I click on administration and go to email actions, this will show me all the email actions in the system. Email actions are just emails that your server sends out based on certain actions that are taken or events that occur. So there's some type of triggering event that makes an email action be sent out. And part of what you can configure is who do the emails go to. Let's take a look at this account lockout one as an example. So I'm going to click edit next to that. Now, there are a lot of different settings we can configure here. I'm not going to cover all of these in this session. We do actually have a session on email actions and email reminders in this conference. So if you'd like to learn more, you can attend that session. What I want to highlight here is the recipient piece of this. So for this email, currently the recipient is the system administrators group. Now, some of the options that you'll see in your email actions are contextual based upon the action itself. So for example, one of our options here is the user. So you could have the email go to the user who was actually locked out. But if you click on add groups users, again, there is a list of all the groups in your system. And you could select any of them and add them to be notified. We could check the box next to mad scientist, for example, click save, and then now everyone in the mad scientist group would receive this email when it gets sent out. All right. Another type of notification that I want to tell you about is group managers. So there's actually a setting that I didn't show you yet on groups. If I go to administration groups, let's go back here and let's go to the mad scientist group. So right now the mad scientist group has 2 members. Now, in addition to being able to add members to groups, you can also add managers. And the reason to do this is that managers for a group will receive notifications about overdue tasks assigned to any members of that group. So this is a way you can manage those notifications. So I'm going to right click on Mad Scientist. Let's say I want to add myself as a manager for this group. So to do so, you just right click, go to add remove, and instead of members, you select managers. When I do that, it shows me a list of users in the system. Now again, keep in mind, I could hit view and change it to groups view and select groups as well. In this case, I'm just going to choose an individual. I'm going to choose myself. So I'm going to check the box next to my name, click save. And then now if I expand the mad scientist group, you can see that my name is in there in bold. This is just a visual shorthand to let you know that this person is a manager for this group, but they are not a member for the group. Okay, so I will not receive any permissions from Mad Scientist. I won't be assigned tasks that are sent to Mad Scientist, etc. Because I'm not a member of the group. I'm just a manager. So all this does is makes it so that if Dr. No or Carl Mortner have overdue tasks, I'll get a notification. I'll get an email. Now, you can have users or groups that are both members and managers of the group. I could right click on Mad Scientist, go to add remove, click on members. We can see that I'm not currently selected. I could select myself and add myself in there. And then now I can see my name is bold and underlined. And that's just another visual shorthand to let me know this person is both a member of this group and a manager. So you've got a lot of options there for how you want to customize that. Okay. The last type of notification that I want to tell you about you can manage with groups is report instances. So if I click on reports and let's go to that workflow tab, we can see that we've got a workflow instance here. A workflow instance is just a report that already has the filters pre-selected so that when you run it, it just shows you the results that you need to see. Now, another cool thing about instances is they can be scheduled to be delivered to people on a recurring basis. If I click edit next to this instance, it'll actually take me to the scheduler and I can configure that. Now, again, you can see here are all the groups in the system. I could select any of these groups and then configure these other settings to choose when and how is this report instance delivered to that group. This can be useful for users maybe that don't log into the system very often, but need to keep tabs on certain things in Qualtrax. You can make it so that they get a given report on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. But you can manage that with groups. You can have it be sent to all of these groups. Okay. Now that I've talked through all the different uses of groups in the system and showed you them in the system and where to configure them and how to configure them, you can see all of the ways they're used, all right? What I want to talk about next is ways to think about groups that can be useful to help understand them and understand the best ways to use them in your system. So the first thing that I'll highlight is this concept of Venn diagrams. So I know for myself, it helps me to think about groups as Venn diagrams because it just helps me kind of hold in my mind the way my groups are structured and what they're going to do. So on this diagram, you can see that the circles are the groups themselves, and then these people icons are the individual users in those groups. And users can be in multiple groups, just like in the diagram. For example, Raul Silva is a member of Criminal Mastermind, which means he's also a member of Villains, which means he's also a member of Spectre. So thinking about it as Venn diagrams can be really helpful to think about, the intersection of these things. Someone can be in multiple groups, and it's sort of like a Venn diagram. Something that goes along with that is that groups are additive and not subtractive. So what I mean by this is users gain the sum total of all permissions, security, access, tasks, responsibilities, and notifications from all of the groups of which they are a member. So they only add on to each other. To look at this from another angle, being in a group with less permissions or access doesn't take away from the permissions or access granted by the other groups the user is a member of. One example of this is Carl Mortner. You can see that he is a member of both Mad Scientist and the Henchman group. Now, the Henchman group has no permissions, but that doesn't mean that it takes away the permissions that Carl gets from the other groups that he's a member of. It's just that Henchman doesn't add any permissions. All right, so additive, not subtractive. And then the last thing that I'll highlight here about ways to think about groups is groups are often multi-purpose. You can configure your groups so that they serve multiple needs within your organization. And we've seen this, for example, the Mad Scientist group grants all the permissions needed for the role. It grants view and edit security to the appropriate documents. It assigns document review tasks, as well as many other settings that are integral to that role. So it's best to make groups multi-purpose when you can, because it just makes things a lot more convenient and easier to manage. Now, that being said, single-purpose groups can also be useful when situations call for it. One example of this is maybe a special duties group, which grants the ability to launch a workflow specific to a special duty that one or more user has, but that maybe isn't a core part of any one job role. You might make a group that its sole purpose is to manage that. But I would say that that is the exception rather than the rule. Whenever you can, it's best to make groups multi-purpose because it helps you out with multiple things at once. But don't be afraid to make single-purpose groups as needed. All right. Now that we've talked through all of this, I want to kind of wrap up the training portion by kind of highlighting the reasons why you should use groups. Why you should use these instead of individuals whenever possible. The first one is that managing users at a group level creates a standardized experience for your users. I know that anyone in the Mad Scientist group has the same permissions and security and access and all of these things that every other Mad Scientist does. And that makes it a lot easier to manage. When I bring on a Mad Scientist to the Spectre organization, I can just add them to that group, but I know that they have the same experience as my other Mad Scientists. Another reason you should use groups is that with a single action, you can get multiple results. So adding or removing a member from a group is a single action that automatically reconfigures their permissions, access, responsibilities, tasks, and notifications all at once. Likewise, changing the settings or assignments for a group is a single action that automatically applies those changes to all members of that group. So this saves you a lot of time and hassle. Another reason to use groups is that nested groups can extend the functionality of your groups. So adding groups as members of other groups provides even more layers of control and customization to your personnel administration, as we've seen with the Mad Scientist group and the way it's nested within those other groups. And the last point here is actually something that kind of ties together all of these, which is convenience. That's what a lot of this is about. It's much easier to change user settings using groups than individually. If you configure these things individually, then whenever you need to change it individually. You need to find all those places in the system where it was configured with individuals and make changes to it. It's much more convenient to do that with groups. One other piece of convenience there as well is that you can even add users to groups when you create them in the system. So I'll wrap up the training portion by showing you that. Let's say I go to administration and go to personnel, and I want to click on add users. I want to add a new user to the system. I can go in here and fill out all the information for that user, and then when I'm ready, I can click on the group membership tab. And again, here are all the groups in the system. And I could select any of these, and then when I create the user, they're automatically added to that group. And if I've configured that group in the system, then I've done a whole bunch of work with just one action. So it is far more convenient to manage these things with groups rather than individually. I hope that this training session has helped demonstrate that, all the ways you can use groups and why you would want to. All right, so let's take some questions here. So the first question is, if you create a group for former employees, how do you disable the user from the all users group and then add them to the former users group? Read through that again. If you create a group for former employees, how do you disable the user from the all users group and then add them to the former users group? So if a user is disabled, they actually won't be in any group. Not only are they removed from the all users group, but they are not in any group. A disabled user cannot use your system, and so they cannot be in groups. So you wouldn't actually be able to create a group for former employees if by former employees you mean users that are disabled. Groups can only contain enabled users. Now what you can do is, let's go back to our administrator account here. In administration personnel, which is what I'm looking at right now, it's going to automatically show us only users that are enabled in the system. But there is a checkbox up here to show disabled users. And if you click on that, this list will now contain disabled users as well. Now, what I always do if I'm trying to find just disabled users, I'll click the enable disable column, and that sorts it so that all the disabled users are at the top, and you can tell whether a user is enabled or disabled because of what option shows. If it says disable, that means they're enabled because you can disable them. If it shows enable, it means they are disabled and you can enable them. So I see here too that it says disabled users may show in the all users group in the groups module. Let's take a look at that. I want to verify this. So let's go back to personnel. I want to see those disabled users. We'll choose one of them. So let's say auditor number 1, top of the list here. Auditor number 1 is currently disabled. So let's go to administration groups, all users. Oh, there's auditor number 1. Okay, I'll need to dig into that one some more, and we'll get you guys an answer to that. Because yeah, it's my understanding they got pulled out of that group. So I need to do some research on that one and find out. So let's say if it does allow you to do that, how do you disable the user from the all users group? So I see what you're saying. If let's say, basically what you're asking is, how do you remove someone from the all users group? And there is not a way to do that. All right, the all users group is automatically managed by your server, and so it'll automatically have all those users in it. Now, keep in mind, if they're disabled, they can't log in to your Qualtrax server. They can't use it. They're not going to get notifications. For all intents and purposes, even though they may be in that group, nothing's going to happen for them. So you don't have to necessarily worry about them being in there, that it will somehow give them access to the system again, because disabling them takes care of that. They can't access your system anymore. That's a really good question. We'll find out some of the details on the other piece of that, and we can get that information to you as well after the conference. Let's see, we've got about 6 minutes left. We'll see if there are any other questions that we want to highlight here at the end. So yeah, if you do have any questions, place those into the attendee hub, and I'll be happy to answer them here in the last few minutes of this session. No questions? Okay. All right. I hope this has helped expand your understanding of groups and the ways that you can use them in Qualtrax to meet your organization's needs. If you have any additional questions, after the session, please don't hesitate to email us at services@qualtrax.com. That goes to everyone on my team. That's the team that I'm on. So any questions you have, just send it that way. If you have any technical questions, like specifically how does something work, or maybe the system does something you don't expect or something like that, you can also reach out to the support team. and that's just support@qualtrax.com, and they can offer any technical assistance that you need. So thank you all very much for attending this session. I hope you have a great day and that you enjoy the rest of the conference.